You know, some battles you choose, and some battles, well, they drive right up to your front gate wearing a badly fitting uniform and try to dismantle your life, all because they want a key they're not entitled to. If you've ever tangled with a homeowners association that thinks it owns the very air you breathe, you might get a chuckle out of this. But for me, it was a full-blown war that ended with my 3-0-pound bull, Zeus, making a very definitive statement on property rights. They really thought their little orange vests and laminated badges made them untouchable. These self-appointed guardians of conformity from the Celestial Vistas HOA, an entity I wasn't even a part of. Thank God. And they genuinely believed they could force me to use their pathetic universal lock on my brand new, very expensive ranch gate, just so they could wander onto my land whenever their little hearts desired. Their excuse? Emergency access. A phrase so vague it could mean anything from a genuine crisis to them wanting a shortcut for their golf carts. When I refused, explaining patiently for the 10th time that my 10,000-acre cattle ranch, the Bar M, was private property and not some community park, their puffed-up little leader, a specimen named Chad Kensington III, and his even more ridiculous head of security, a man whose actual name was Gary, but insisted on being called Commander Steele, decided direct action was their only recourse. They learned the hard way that some gates are best left unopened, especially when Zeus is feeling territorial. It all started about 6 months after I'd finally taken over full management of the Bar M. My grandfather, old Jebediah, had run this ranch for 50 years, a sprawling piece of Montana that had been in our family since before Montana was even a state, practically. It was my sanctuary, my legacy, and a working cattle operation that kept me more than busy. The closest thing to an HOA was the occasional grumble from a neighbor about a stray calf, settled over coffee and a handshake. Then, Celestial Vistas began to metastasize on our eastern border. It was one of those sprawling developments of beige houses, all looking identical, with perfectly manicured tiny lawns and an absolute Bible of rules about everything from mailbox color to the permitted species of garden gnome. I pitied the folks who lived there, but it wasn't my concern until Chad Kensington III was elected HOA president. Chad had retired early from some middle management something or other back east, and clearly missed being a tiny little god in a tiny little kingdom. He saw the Bar M not as a historic working ranch, but as an untamed wilderness that offended his beige sensibilities, and, more importantly, as a potential thoroughfare or expansion zone for his vision of Celestial Vistas. The first salvo was subtle, a friendly neighbor letter inviting me to an HOA meeting to discuss synergies and community standards. I politely declined via email, stating the Bar M was not, nor would it ever be, part of Celestial Vistas. This, apparently, was seen not as a statement of fact, but as a challenge. A few weeks later, after a minor incident where some joyriding teenagers cut a section of my old wire fence far from the main entrance, I decided to upgrade my main access. I invested in a heavy-duty, galvanized steel gate, set between two imposing stone pillars I'd had custom-built, complete with a top-of-the-line keypad and a seriously beefy, unpickable lock. It was about security for my livestock and equipment, plain and simple. Little did I know, this gate would become Chad Kensington's white whale and Commander Steele's Waterloo. The ink was barely dry on the contractor's invoice when the first official-looking letter from Celestial Vistas HOA arrived, citing a non-existent easement requirement and demanding that I replace my secure lock with one of their standard HOA-issued emergency access locks, for which, naturally, they held the master key. The letter was signed by Chad, full of puffed-up legalese that smelled suspiciously like it was copied from a HOA Management for Dummies website. It mentioned things like unimpeded ingress and egress for vital community services, and ensuring the safety and harmony of the greater area. Greater area? My ranch was a self-contained world. Their vital community services had no business on my land. This was clearly about control and convenience for them, probably to access some BLM land further west without having to drive the long way around. Or perhaps Chad just didn't like looking at a gate he couldn't personally open. I remember laughing as I read it, thinking it was some kind of joke. Oh, how naive I was. This wasn't a joke. This was a declaration of war, from a man whose only real power came from a laminated ID badge and the misplaced deference of people who didn't know any better. He fundamentally misunderstood that my property line was not a suggestion, but a legally defined boundary he was not welcome to cross, key or no key. I drafted a polite but firm reply, enclosing a copy of my property deed, highlighting the absence of any such easement, and reiterated that my security arrangements were non-negotiable. I figured that would be the end of it. How wrong I was. Chad and his commander were just getting warmed up. The second official letter arrived a week later, more demanding this time, hand-delivered by none other than Commander Steele himself, looking like a discount mall cop in a beige polo shirt, 2 sizes too small, emblazoned with a poorly embroidered Celestial Vistas security logo, and a ridiculously oversized plastic badge that read, Commander. HOA enforcement. He even had a little clipboard and one of those clicky pens, the kind that signals maximum self-importance. He found me mending a fence line near the main road. Mr. Morgan, he announced, his voice an octave higher than you'd expect from someone named Commander Steele. I have a formal notice for you from President Kensington and the Celestial Vistas Homeowners Association Board of Directors. He presented the envelope with a flourish, as if it were a royal decree. The letter, typed in an aggressive bold font, reiterated the demand for their special lock. It now included a thinly veiled threat about necessary actions to ensure compliance for community safety, and cited some HOA bylaw that had absolutely no jurisdiction over my ranch. I read it slowly, then looked at Steele. Gary? I began intentionally using his real name, which I'd learned from a chatty grocery store clerk who lived in Celestial Vistas, and found the whole Commander charade hilarious. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. It's Commander Steele, he corrected, puffing out his chest slightly. Right. Well, Gary, tell Chad that, once again, my ranch isn't part of Celestial Vistas. This document, I waved the letter, is as relevant to me as a knitting pattern. My property, my gate, my lock, is that clear? Steele's face reddened. Sir, the HOA has a right to access its designated easements for utility, maintenance, and emergency services. Your gate is obstructing a vital corridor. I had to bite back a laugh. Vital corridor? Commander, this road, I pointed down my private gravel driveway, leads to my house, my barns, and about 10,000 acres of my cattle. The only utility it services is mine. The only emergency it might see is one of my cows having a difficult birth. There's no Celestial Vistas easement here. My grandfather would be spinning in his grave if he heard this nonsense. Steele sputtered. President Kensington has maps. He has records. He says there's historical precedent. I almost asked if those maps were drawn in crayon. Then President Kensington is mistaken. Or he's lying. If he has legitimate legal documents proving an easement, he needs to present them through proper legal channels, not by sending his glorified errand boy to harass me. Steele bristled. I am head of security, he yelped, and this is a formal warning. If you refuse to cooperate, the HOA will be forced to undertake measures to ensure access. We might have to deinstall the gate temporarily. I just stared at him. Deinstall my gate? My brand new $5,000 custom-built gate? Over some imaginary easement? The audacity was breathtaking. Let me be very clear, Gary, I said, my voice dropping to a much calmer, colder tone. You, Chad, or anyone else from Celestial Vistas sets foot on my property without my express permission, particularly to tamper with my gate, and I will consider it trespassing and vandalism. I will involve the actual, real, sworn law enforcement, not the make-believe kind. Are we crystal clear on that? He gulped, some of the bluster deflating. I will relay your uncooperative stance to President Kensington, he mumbled, clutching his clipboard like a life raft. He then scurried back to his little golf cart, which also had a CVHOA security sticker on it, and a tiny flashing amber light on top that just screamed, "Insecurity Complex." I watched him go, a knot of anger and disbelief tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor anymore. This was shaping up to be a genuine fight. I knew Chad wasn't going to just let this go. People like him, obsessed with petty power, couldn't stand being told no, especially by someone they considered an outsider anachronism. The next few days were filled with an undercurrent of anxiety. I started documenting everything, saving the letters, noting the time and nature of Steele's visit. I even called my cousin, a lawyer down in Helena, just to get a preliminary take. She confirmed what I already knew. Unless they could produce a legally recorded easement, they didn't have a leg to stand on. But she also warned me that HOAs, particularly ones led by Napoleonic figures like Chad, could be incredibly persistent and willing to rack up legal fees, usually other people's money, to get their way. I started making sure my own security cameras, the ones covering the main gate and driveway, were fully operational and recording 24/7. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about defending my home and my way of life from entitled bullies. The harassment, as I fully expected, escalated. Within a week, I started receiving official-looking violation notices from Celestial Vistas, slid under my gate in the dead of night. These were pure comedy gold, if they weren't so infuriating. One cited my unapproved agricultural fencing material, the same barbed wire that had been there for 70 years and was standard for ranches. Another complained about excessive bovine vocalizations during designated quiet hours. Quiet hours for cows? Did Chad expect me to issue them all tiny little bovine muzzles after 10 p.m.? A particularly amusing one mentioned unregulated manure odor encroaching on Celestial Vista's common areas, which was physically impossible, given the prevailing winds and the sheer distance between my barns and their precious beige boxes. Each notice came with a supposed fine and a threat of further action. I bundled them all up and sent them certified mail to my cousin Sarah, who was now officially on a very small retainer. She advised me to send a formal cease and desist letter, drafted by her, to Chad Kensington and the Celestial Vistas HOA board, outlining their lack of jurisdiction, accusing them of harassment, and warning them of legal repercussions if their actions continued. We sent it, registered mail, signature required. Chad himself signed for it. For about 3 days, there was blessed silence. I almost dared to hope that the sharply worded legal letter, complete with scary lawyer letterhead, had shocked some sense into him. Then, the drone appeared. It was a consumer-grade drone, buzzing high over my front pasture, clearly filming my house, my barns, and paying particular attention to the new gate. It would hover for a bit, then zip back towards Celestial Vistas. This happened twice in one day. It was invasive, creepy, and almost certainly illegal surveillance without consent on private property. That evening, as I was checking on Zeus in his massive paddock near the front of the ranch, he liked to be near the action, that old bull. I saw Commander Steele again. He wasn't on my property, but he was parked just outside my gate on the public access road shoulder, his ridiculous golf cart angled so he had a clear view down my driveway. He was holding a pair of binoculars. This was beyond petty. This was stalking. Zeus, a magnificent Chevrolet bull, easily tipping the scales at 3,000 pounds of pure, unadulterated prime beef and attitude, let out a low, rumbling snort and stomped a hoof, his massive head, with its formidable horns, swinging towards the golf cart. Steele, to his credit or perhaps just due to poor eyesight, didn't seem to notice the bull's displeasure, too engrossed in his pretend spy games. I walked down the drive. "Evening, Gary," I said, my voice deliberately loud. He jumped, fumbling the binoculars. "Commander Steele," he insisted, his voice cracking. "Just conducting routine perimeter observations. Standard procedure for community safety." I leaned against my gatepost. "Observing what, exactly? Whether my grass is growing in a regulation manner? Whether Zeus here is plotting a hostile takeover of your pudding green?" Zeus let out another snort, louder this time, and took a few steps towards the fence line, his gaze fixed on Steele's golf cart. The cart suddenly seemed very small and flimsy. Steele's eyes darted to Zeus, then back to me, a new layer of nervousness appearing. "Hostile bovines are a security concern," he muttered, clearly trying to regain some composure. "And that gate remains a violation of HOA access protocols." I sighed. "Gary, we've been over this. There are no HOA protocols that apply to me or my bull. This is my land. Your observations are harassment. Your drone is illegal surveillance. The letters are frivolous and constitute nuisance. My lawyer, Sarah, is compiling a rather impressive file on Celestial Vistas, President Kensington, and you, Commander. Keep it up, and you'll be observing the inside of a courtroom." The mention of a lawyer and courtrooms seemed to make him even more twitchy. He avoided looking at Zeus, who was now idly rubbing one of his horns against a fence post, making the entire structure vibrate. It was a subtle display of power, but effective. "I am just following President Kensington's directives," he said, sounding more like a beleaguered underling than a bold commander. "Then tell President Kensington his directives are leading him and this HOA into serious legal trouble. Tell him I'm not some pushover retiree in one of his beige boxes he can bully. And tell him," I gestured toward Zeus, who had now started to kick up a little dust with a front hoof, "that my head of security doesn't use binoculars, and he really doesn't like uninvited guests with silly hats. Now, if you don't mind, it's getting dark, and my bull likes his privacy." Steele didn't need telling twice. He fumbled with the ignition of his golf cart, gave one last fearful glance at Zeus, and then zipped away, his little amber light flashing impotently in the twilight. I knew this wasn't the end. Chad Kensington was too invested, too arrogant, but I also knew I was prepared. The more they escalated, the more ammunition they gave me, and I had a feeling Zeus was just as tired of their nonsense as I was. The very next morning, things took a more direct and alarming turn. I was out checking the northern fence line, a good 2 miles from the main gate, when my phone buzzed with an alert from my security camera system. It was a motion detection notification from the camera covering the main gate. I pulled up the live feed, my heart sinking. There they were, Commander Steele, looking even more self-important in what appeared to be a brand new, slightly better-fitting security vest, accompanied by 2 unfamiliar men in work clothes, carrying toolboxes. And observing from his golf cart, parked just a smidge too close to my actual property line on the public road, was Chad Kensington III himself, arms crossed, looking smug. They weren't just observing anymore. They were clearly there to follow through on their threat to de-install my gate. I jumped on my quad bike and gunned it towards the entrance, my mind racing. This was a blatant act of trespass and attempted property destruction. My call to Sarah earlier had confirmed the cease and desist should have stopped them, but apparently Chad considered lawyer letters to be mere suggestions. As I sped closer, I could see them milling about the gate. Steele was pointing at the hinges, gesturing expansively, while the 2 workmen looked less than enthusiastic. They hadn't actually touched the gate yet, but their intent was clear. I arrived in a cloud of dust, killing the engine and hopping off the quad. "Kensington, Steele, what in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing?" My voice was louder than I intended, echoing slightly in the morning air. Chad turned, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ah, Mr. Morgan. We were just about to commence the temporary removal of this unauthorized access barrier. As per our numerous notifications, it's a safety hazard and impedes essential HOA access." He said it so calmly, as if he were discussing pruning a rosebush. Steele puffed himself up. "We have the authority, sir. Old Covenants. Emergency Access Clause. Section 7. Subparagraph B." I looked at the 2 workmen, who suddenly found the toes of their boots fascinating. "And you two? Are you licensed and insured to perform work on private property you've just trespassed upon, at the behest of this amateur dictator?" They mumbled something unintelligible. "They're bonded contractors, Morgan," Chad interjected smoothly, "operating under HOA directives. Perfectly legal." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, mentally at least. "Chad," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline. "You are currently trespassing. Your commander and these gentlemen are trespassing. There is no HOA covenant that applies to me. There is no emergency. There is no legitimate easement you can produce. This gate stays. Your crew touches it, and I will be calling Sheriff Miller directly, and I'll be pressing charges for trespassing, attempted vandalism, and conspiracy to commit property damage. I have every one of your ridiculous letters, videos of Steele's stalking behavior, footage of your drone, and now, footage of this little escapade." I tapped the smartphone in my shirt pocket, which was indeed recording. Chad's smirk faltered for a microsecond. Steele, however, seemed emboldened by his boss's presence. "We are simply enforcing community standards and ensuring vital access. President Kensington has authorized this action for the good of Celestial Vistas," he declared, taking a step towards the gate with a wrench he'd procured from one of the toolboxes. It was almost comical. "The good of Celestial Vistas does not involve trampling on my private property rights, Gary," I snapped. "One more step, and I am dialing 911. Just then, as Steele took another hesitant step, there was a sound from behind me, from the large pasture that bordered the main driveway and gate area. It was a low, guttural bellow, a sound that vibrated through the ground. All heads turned. Zeus, my 3,000-pound Chevrolet bull, was standing about 50 yards away, head up, ears pricked, watching the proceedings with an intensity that was palpable even from that distance. He'd obviously heard the commotion and come to investigate. His paddock gate, the one leading into the wider area near the main ranch gate, was, as luck would have it, slightly ajar. I'd been meaning to fix the latch, but ranch chores sometimes pile up. Right now, I was incredibly glad for my minor procrastination. Chad squinted. "Is that one of your animals?" he asked, a hint of disdain in his voice. "That," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face, "is Zeus. He's my head of ranch security. And he takes his job very, very seriously. He's particularly averse to uninvited guests with bad intentions and shiny tools." Zeus let out another, louder bellow and took a few ponderous, deliberate steps closer, his massive shoulders rippling. The two workmen visibly tensed and took a step back from the gate. Their enthusiasm for dismantling anything had clearly evaporated. Chad Kensington, however, seemed to believe his authority extended to all creatures, great and small. "Well, keep your livestock under control, Morgan," he said dismissively, though his eyes kept flicking nervously towards the approaching bull. "Commander Steele, proceed with the lock assessment." Steele, caught between his loyalty to Chad's delusions and the rapidly diminishing distance between himself and 3,000 pounds of angry bull, looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. He raised the wrench, his hand trembling slightly, and approached one of the gate hinges. Zeus, perhaps interpreting the raised wrench as a direct challenge or simply curious about the shiny object, lowered his great head and let out a rumbling snort, then broke into a surprisingly agile trot directly towards the gate, not aggressively, but with a definite sense of purpose. It was a sight to behold. This mountain of muscle, white hide gleaming in the morning sun, horns like polished ivory, covering the ground with deceptive speed. The two workmen didn't wait for a formal invitation to leave. They dropped their toolboxes with a clatter and scrambled back towards the public road, one of them nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. "Hey, get back here!" Chad yelled after them, his voice cracking. "You're under contract!" They didn't even look back. Commander Steele, meanwhile, found himself directly in Zeus's path. He froze, wrench still in hand, eyes wide as dinner plates. Zeus came to a halt about 10 feet from him, lowered his head again, and pawed the ground, sending a shower of gravel into the air. He wasn't charging. Not yet. But he was making it abundantly clear that Steele and his wrench were not welcome. Steele let out a small, involuntary squeak and dropped the wrench as if it were red hot. He then executed a surprisingly nimble, if undignified, backward scramble, crab walking away from the bull. Chad was now shouting, a mixture of fury and panic in his voice. "Steele, do something! Control that That beast! Commander Steele, from a safer distance near Chad's golf cart, yelled back, "It's a bull, sir! A very large bull! I'm not a matador!" Zeus then turned his attention to the abandoned toolboxes. He nudged one with his massive head, sending tools spilling onto the gravel. He sniffed at a shiny hammer, then, with a disdainful snort, gave the toolbox a more forceful shove, flipping it over completely. He seemed to be conducting his own inventory of unauthorized equipment. Chad, finally realizing the situation was irretrievably lost and possibly dangerous, was frantically trying to get his golf cart turned around on the narrow shoulder. "This isn't over, Morgan!" he shrieked, his face flushed. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is an outrage, endangering the public with a vicious animal." I just laughed. "Vicious? Chad, he's just curious. And very protective of his home. Unlike some people, he understands boundaries. Now, I suggest you and Commander Feathers, or whatever his name is today, remove yourselves, before Zeus decides your golf cart looks like a giant chew toy." Zeus, as if on cue, took a few ambling steps towards the sputtering golf cart, his gaze unwavering. That was all the encouragement Chad needed. He slammed the accelerator, and the golf cart shot off down the road towards Celestial Vistas, Commander Steele clinging on for dear life, his commander badge flapping in the wind. I watched them go, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over me. Zeus let out one final triumphant snort, then ambled over to me, nudging my hand gently with his huge head, as if asking for a congratulatory scratch. "Good boy, Zeus," I said, rubbing him between the horns. "You handled that perfectly." The abandoned toolboxes and the dropped wrench lay on my side of the property line, silent testament to the HOA's failed invasion. I picked up my phone, which had been recording the entire hilarious, terrifying, and ultimately vindicating encounter. This footage, I thought, was pure gold. Not only did it show their trespass and attempted vandalism, but it also featured a bull peacefully but firmly asserting his property rights. Try explaining that away in court, Chad. The aftermath was, shall we say, deeply satisfying. The first thing I did after Chad and Commander Steele beat their hasty retreat was call Sheriff Miller. I explained the situation, mentioned the ongoing harassment, the prior cease and desist, and the morning's attempted gate removal, complete with trespass and the presence of what amounted to hired goons. I also mentioned I had it all on video. Sheriff Miller, a man who knew my grandfather well and had little patience for HOA overreach, especially from city folk trying to impose their will on established agricultural land, listened patiently. He promised to send a deputy out. Deputy Marcus arrived about an hour later. I showed him the video. He watched the whole thing, from Steele's initial grandstanding with the wrench to the workman's panicked flight and Chad's golf cart Grand Prix escape. When Zeus made his entrance, a wide grin spread across Deputy Marcus's face. He replayed the part where Steele dropped the wrench and crab-walked backward 3 times, chuckling. "Well, Mr. Morgan," he said, trying to compose himself, "looks like your bull handled most of the de-escalation himself. Can't say I blame those fellows for running." Zeus is an impressive animal. He took my formal statement, cataloged the abandoned tools as evidence, and assured me he'd be paying a visit to Mr. Kensington and Mr. Steele. He also mentioned that impersonating any kind of law enforcement or security with authoritative insignia, if it was intended to deceive or coerce, could tread into murky legal waters, especially when combined with trespass. Later that day, I saw Deputy Marcus's cruiser parked outside the Celestial Vistas HOA Community Center for a good long while. I never found out exactly what was said, but the effect was immediate and profound. The nightly drone surveillance stopped. Commander Steele's perimeter patrols ceased. No more little love notes from the HOA were slipped under my gate. It was as if a switch had been flipped. My cousin Sarah, upon viewing the video, which I gleefully sent her, cackled for a full 5 minutes. She then drafted another letter, this one far more aggressive, to Chad Kensington, the HOA board, and their now identified bonded contractors, whose bond and insurance we were very interested in verifying after their stunt. It detailed the events, included still photos from the video, Zeus looking particularly majestic and Chad looking particularly flustered, and strongly advised them that any further contact, harassment, or attempts to access my property would result in immediate legal action, seeking significant damages for trespass, harassment, attempted property damage, nuisance, and emotional distress, not to mention a formal complaint about their pseudo-security force. We also sent copies to the local county commissioner and the state board that lightly oversaw HOAs, just for good measure, along with a polite inquiry about the legality of HOA security personnel dressing and acting like discount law enforcement. The silence from Celestial Vistas was deafening. A week later, I heard through the local grapevine, which in our rural area travels faster than fiber optics, that there had been a rather stormy emergency HOA meeting at Celestial Vistas. Apparently, some residents, who were already tired of Chad's iron-fisted rule and escalating HOA dues funding his personal vendettas, were not pleased to learn their fees were being used to harass a neighboring rancher and potentially embroil them in a costly lawsuit. The story of Commander Steele versus the Bull became something of a local legend, much to Steele's, whose real name Gary was now widely known, chagrin. He apparently resigned his post as head of security shortly thereafter, citing irreconcilable differences in tactical approaches. Chad Kensington III, I heard, faced a vote of no confidence but narrowly clung to power, though significantly humbled, and with his wings thoroughly clipped by his own board, who were now terrified of another bull-related international incident. The abandoned toolboxes sat in my barn for a month. When no one claimed them despite a formal notice sent by Sarah, I donated the usable tools to the local 4-H club. The wrench Commander Steele dropped? I mounted it on a plaque in my workshop, with a little brass plate beneath it. The Persuader, courtesy of CVHOA. Zeus, of course, became the undisputed hero of the Bar M. He got extra sweet feed, new deluxe scratching posts made from old telephone poles, and the undying gratitude of his owner. My gate remained, secure and untouched, a monument to common sense and the right to peaceful enjoyment of one's property. Every now and then, I'd see a car from Celestial Vistas slow down as it passed my entrance, the occupants craning their necks, perhaps hoping for a glimpse of the fearsome bull that had routed their overzealous leadership. And I'd just smile, knowing that sometimes the best defense against petty tyranny isn't a lawyer or a strongly worded letter, but a 3-0-pound bull with a clear understanding of whose grass is whose. If you're out there, Chad, still dreaming of master keys and universal access, just remember Zeus. He remembers you. And trust me, his memory is elephantine, or perhaps bull-effantine. Drop a comment if you've ever had an HOA try to pull a fast one. I'd love to hear your stories. This kind of nonsense needs to be called out.